Hi everyone, I've created this video to help you understand the cardiac formula. So we are going to go through the cardiac formula and all the different things that affect it and some of the relationships that work within it. So the cardiac formula is stroke volume times heart rate equals cardiac output. And I have it drawn out here. So let's talk about what each of these things mean. Cardiac output is the milliliters of blood ejected from the heart per minute. I'll just put milliliters of blood per minute. Your body is very interested in cardiac output and very interested in keeping cardiac output as high as it needs to be to perfuse the vital organs. There's two things that affect cardiac output: how fast your heart is beating in beats per minute, that's heart rate, and also stroke volume, which is the milliliters ejected per beat. So the milliliters ejected from your heart per beat times the beats per minute equals the milliliters of blood ejected from the heart per minute, and that's the cardiac formula. There's different things that affect stroke volume and heart rate, and there's relationships between them. One thing that affects stroke volume is preload. Preload, another way of saying preload is saying end diastolic volume. So if this is my heart, and there's my left ventricle, diastole is the resting phase of the heart. So in diastole, your heart, and it happens quicker than this, but just drawing it here, your heart fills up with blood like this. So at end diastole, your heart has had a good long time to rest. So your left ventricle is as full as it could possibly be. And that's the end diastolic volume, the volume in that ventricle at end diastole. So that's what preload is. And there's two things that make up preload: circulating volume and venous return. So that's a way of saying there's two things that make up end diastolic volume: circulating volume and venous return. If you have a greater circulating volume, so that's just the amount of blood that you have in your body, you are going to have an increased preload, and therefore you are going to have an increased stroke volume, and therefore you are going to have an increased cardiac output. There's different things that affect your circulating volume, and you can take medications to affect your circulating volume. So for instance, if you gave someone fluid, intravenous fluid, you are going to increase circulating volume. If you diurese someone, diuresis, you are going to decrease circulating volume, and sometimes we want to do that. So circulating volume affects preload because it's just simply how much fluid you have in your body. The other thing that affects preload is venous return. So this is how much blood is actually able to get from the peripheries. So there's the body, there's the heart. How much blood is actually able to get from the peripheries back to the left ventricle. Back to the left ventricle. And there's different things that affect that. If you, for example, are on bed rest and you don't have this calf muscle pump working, you're going to have less venous blood returning to the heart because it's the calf muscle pump that helps us get venous blood back to the heart. That's one example of venous return. So if you have a decreased venous return, you're going to have a decreased preload, and therefore a decreased stroke volume, and therefore a decreased cardiac output. What happens when stroke volume decreases? So I gave two examples of stroke volume decreasing, but what happens within this formula when stroke volume decreases? Well, stroke volume and heart rate work together to support cardiac output. So if your stroke volume decreases, your heart rate is going to increase as a compensation. So that's why people that have, let's say, undergone a trauma and lost a lot of blood are going to be tachycardic because your body is still trying to support cardiac output. So that's what preload is. Preload affects stroke volume because it's the actual amount of blood that is in the heart at end diastole. Now let's talk about afterload. Afterload is the second thing that affects stroke volume. Another way to say afterload is to say systemic vascular resistance. So here's the heart again, and there's the left ventricle. And there's the aorta coming off the left ventricle. And then of course we have our vascular tree that goes all throughout our body. When the left ventricle squeezes, it has to overcome the resistance in the vasculature. So if you are extremely vasoconstricted, there's my aorta and it's very vasoconstricted, you are going to have an increased systemic vascular resistance because it's much harder to push against vasoconstriction than it is against vasodilation. If your vessels are like this, there's much less systemic vascular resistance. It's easy for the left ventricle to pump and push against a vasodilated system. So that's one thing that affects systemic vascular resistance: diameter, the diameters of your vessels. So if you are extremely vasoconstricted, like this, and I don't mean the aorta necessarily is vasoconstricted, I'm just drawing this for concept purposes, you're going to have increased systemic vascular resistance. If you are vasodilated, you are going to have decreased systemic vascular resistance. So that is one thing that affects afterload. The other thing that affects afterload is volume. So we talked about diameter already. Now let's talk about volume. If you have a really, really high amount of volume floating around, you are going to have an increased systemic vascular resistance. Let's say that you have a lot of fluid volume. Well, it's going to be harder for the left ventricle to push and empty against that fluid volume when you have a lot of volume on board, as opposed to if you don't have a lot of volume on board. And again, just for concept map purposes, we'll pretend this aorta is half full. It's not really like that, but we'll just pretend it is. So this is going to be a lot easier to push against because it's not pushing against as much pressure as this ventricle is. So volume and diameter affect afterload. Another way of saying afterload is saying systemic vascular resistance. If you have an increased systemic vascular resistance, you are going to have a decreased stroke volume because your left ventricle is trying to push hard against the pressure, but maybe it can't overcome that systemic vascular resistance. You're going to have a decreased stroke volume and therefore a decreased cardiac output, and your heart rate might increase as a compensation. So that's what afterload is. People get confused about afterload. They think it's somehow related to preload because it sounds alike. It's not. Afterload is a concept. It's made up of volume and diameter. Preload is an amount of fluid. It's an amount of blood that you have in your body. If you have an increased blood pressure, you're going to have an increased systemic vascular resistance and therefore an increased afterload. So afterload and blood pressure are very closely related. Now let's get into contractility. Contractility is the ability of your left ventricle to squeeze in a really nice, smooth, concerted way. If you have an increased contractility, you're going to have an increased stroke volume and therefore an increased cardiac output. What are the things that affect contractility? Your sympathetic nervous system activation. Your sympathetic nervous system makes your heart beat faster and squeeze harder. So if your sympathetic nervous system is ramped up, you're going to have increased contractility, increased stroke volume, and increased cardiac output. And that makes sense because our sympathetic nervous system wants to deliver oxygenated blood because we are in fight or flight. Your history, your medical history. So let's say you've had an MI in the past, a myocardial infarction. There's your left ventricle, and you have a dead spot right there because you've had an MI. This left ventricle isn't going to be able to do a perfect squeeze because you have a dead spot right there. So that spot is not doing the perfect squeeze. So if you have a history of an MI, you are going to have a potential problem, depending on where in the heart it is, with your stroke volume. The other thing that affects contractility is how much calcium you have. Calcium lets us do muscle work. So if you have a problem with calcium, you could potentially have a problem with contractility and therefore stroke volume. So there's all the things that make up another way of saying contractility is force. So there's all the things that make up the cardiac formula. Let's talk about some of the relationships within these. And maybe I'll do the relationships in yellow. So let's talk about preload and contractility first. These two things have a relationship. When you increase your preload, you are going to increase your contractility to a point. So I'll put ... to a point, because you can actually increase your preload to the point that you have a problem with contractility. So the left ventricle, when it's filled up with blood, it snaps back really nicely. When it has a big amount of blood in it, it snaps back really nicely. Kind of like if you were to stretch an elastic band, it's going to snap back harder the further you stretch it, to a point. So increased preload, filling this up with blood, is going to increase contractility to a point. So just like you can overstretch an elastic band and then you let it go, it's not going to snap back quite as nice because you overstretched it. So if you've ever had a hair tie and you've overstretched the hair tie, it never goes back to how it was before and how stretchy and elastic it was before. That's kind of like preload and contractility, and it's called Starling's law, if you want to look that up. And everyone's tipping point is different. So you might be thinking, how do I know when someone has so much preload that their contractility decreases? Well, everyone's tipping point is different. So if you gave, let's say you gave me 1 liter of fluid, that is going to increase my preload, and my heart would be able to cope with the fluid, and then I would have increased contractility. And I'm 38. If you gave an 88-year-old 1 liter of fluid, they do not have the contractility ability that a younger person has. So that increased preload can actually decrease their contractility to the point that they're not able to fully empty their left ventricle as much as they should. And then the left atrium isn't able to empty all the way because the left ventricle is filling up. The left atrium fills up, and then you are in congestive heart failure. So too much preload can, too much preload can lead to a decrease in contractility. But if you have just the right amount of preload, you will have an increase in contractility. And this is called Starling's law. And the amount of preload is different for everybody. So that's why we have to be very careful about fluid overloading elderly people, because they don't have the contractility that younger people do. Preload and afterload also have a relationship. And it plays into diameter and venous return. So here's the lower legs, and there's a vessel in the lower legs, and here's another set of lower legs, and here's the vessel in this lower leg. So this vessel is vasodilated and it's filled with fluid, and this vessel is vasoconstricted and it's not filled with a lot of fluid. Which one holds more volume? This one holds more volume. It's vasodilated, it's holding more volume. Maybe you have some venous congestion there. So an increased diameter can actually lead to a decreased preload because you have a decreased venous return. Because all your venous blood is sitting there, it's not going back to the heart. You're so vasodilated, it's not going back to the heart. So being extremely vasodilated can actually decrease your cardiac output because you have a decreased venous return, decreased preload, decreased stroke volume, therefore a decreased cardiac output because you have an increased diameter. So that's how preload and afterload work together. Like I've been mentioning, there's another relationship in this, and it's between stroke volume and heart rate. When you have a decreased stroke volume, when you have a decreased stroke volume for whatever reason, you are supposed to get an increased heart rate. So when you have a decreased stroke volume, you are supposed to get an increased heart rate. So stroke volume actually affects the heart rate. So actually I'm going to add this here. Stroke volume actually affects the heart rate. What else affects the heart rate? The sympathetic nervous system, because it's epinephrine that tells our heart to beat faster. So those are just a couple of the relationships in the cardiac formula, and we could get even deeper and deeper into these relationships. We won't get into that right now, so just as long as you understand the basics. But now let's take this a little bit further. Let's say you have a decreased cardiac output for whatever reason. Could be because of a stroke volume problem, or maybe your heart rate has gotten so low that you have a cardiac output problem. You could have either or problem. You could have a low stroke volume, or you could have a low heart rate, but regardless, you have a decreased cardiac output. Well, one of the things that happens when you have a decreased cardiac output is you get decreased renal blood flow. Actually, you can get to a point where you have decreased perfusion to your vital organs, and then you have a whole bunch of different signs and symptoms, but let's just talk about the decreased renal blood flow. When you have a decreased renal blood flow, renin is released from the juxtaglomerular cells of your kidneys. So now we're getting into the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. Renin is released. Renin floats around and meets up with angiotensinogen. Angiotensinogen turns into angiotensin 1, and that turns into angiotensin 2. What does angiotensin 2 do? Well, angiotensin 2 actually does 5 things, but there's 2 categories. So let's talk about the 5 things that it does. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it activates the sympathetic nervous system. It increases sodium and chloride reabsorption, and water likes to follow that, so that means you have increased water. It increases aldosterone secretion. Aldosterone makes you hold on to sodium and water. It makes you vasoconstrict. And it makes you secrete ADH from the posterior pituitary, also known as antidiuretic hormone. So it does 5 things, but there's 2 categories. It makes you vasoconstrict. And it makes you hold fluid. So therefore, you are going to have an increased blood pressure, and also you are going to have an increased cardiac output. If you are holding fluid, you are going to have an increased preload. If you are vasoconstricting, you are going to have an increased blood pressure, and we need some pressure in the vasculature to do gas exchange in our tissues. So that's what RAAS is responsible for, supporting blood pressure and increasing cardiac output. Sometimes RAAS works against us. So how does RAAS know when to kick in? We said when there's a decreased renal blood flow, renin is kicked in. Well, what's a decreased renal blood flow? All of us have a certain set point that our body and brains like our blood pressure to be. So let's say the set point is 120/80. If you drop below 120/80, RAAS is going to kick in. Let's say this is your set point. Now let's say you've engaged in some diet and lifestyle changes, and over the course of years, you have eaten a whole bunch of salty foods. So because on a daily basis you are eating a whole bunch of salty foods, you are actually on a daily basis retaining a whole bunch of fluid because water likes to follow sodium wherever it goes. So eating salty food on a daily basis is going to increase your blood pressure on a daily basis. When you have increased your blood pressure on a daily basis for long enough, your set point changes. So it goes from, let's just pick a number out of here, 150 over 90. So now your body is thinking, okay, you've eaten so many salty foods and you've kept so much water on board. It looks like this is the new set point because this is what your diet has been keeping your blood pressure at. We're going to change the set point to 150 over 90. And now renin kicks in when your blood pressure drops below 150 over 90, and that's chronic hypertension. And that's why hypertension can be so tricky to treat, because you are actually fighting against the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system when you are trying to treat chronic hypertension. And that's why the antihypertensive meds work within this system. So angiotensin 1 converts to angiotensin 2 via angiotensin converting enzyme. So you can take ACE inhibitors. So ACE inhibitors lets this whole process run through, but it stops it right there so that this doesn't happen and your blood pressure doesn't go up. That's one class of antihypertensives. Angiotensin receptor blockers, angiotensin 2 receptor blockers. You can take those and it stops angiotensin 2 from binding to its target organs, so it lets this system go through, but it's going to stop that from happening. That's another antihypertensive. Diuretics. Diuretics let some of the system happen, but they don't let you hold fluid. So it's going to stop this part of the RAAS system. So therefore, your blood pressure is not going to go up. There are some beta blockers that stop or slow down renin release. So I'll put beta blockers there. Not too many beta blockers, but that's just another example. So if you can understand the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system, you can understand pretty much every antihypertensive med. And if you can understand the cardiac formula, you can pretty much understand every cardiac med, because every cardiac med works within this formula or within the RAAS system. So that's an overview of the cardiac formula and the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. We can make this concept map much more complex, and I would encourage you when you're doing your readings to draw out a concept map like this and just keep adding information as you get it. Just keep adding different meds or different things that affect these things or different clinical examples as you learn about them and expand your knowledge that way. I hope you found this helpful.